All right. Hello, everyone. All right, people are just coming in. Right. I'm so excited to be back from winter break. I hope everyone enjoyed their time off and now it's back. All right. Still a few people coming in. All right, I think we'll get started, and if anyone comes in, I'll let them join in. But yeah, hello everyone, and welcome back to our Montessori Town Halls. We hope you enjoyed your winter break. I'm super excited to be introducing our speaker today, Dr. Val Wise. She has loads of experience in childhood education, governance, and leadership. Her recent research and work additionally focuses on social justice, race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Val began her career in a logical place as a student, then as a teacher, moving on to head of school. And now she's on the faculty of Johns Hopkins University, one of the top ranked universities in the United States. And she has a presentation for you. So I'll let her go ahead and take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here with my fellow Montessorians. I started my career as a Montessori primary teacher, so I'm primary trained, and then I became a head of school of a Montessori school for 10 years, and I attributed all of my successes to the foundation of Montessori, how I raised my kids as well. So I appreciate that so much. I'm getting a little background noise, so that may be a challenge in terms of hearing me. So hopefully you can mute yourself if you're, and that way we won't get so much background noise. That's awesome. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and then we can chat a little bit. So give me a thumbs up if you can see engaging voices of color. Awesome. Very good. I love when things come together. So after 25 or 30 years in the field of education, I've transitioned now to becoming a consultant. So I work with schools and for-profits as well as non-for-profits and corporate 500 corporations as well, helping them develop an equity lens. But my heart is always with schools. And so I'm also a qualitative researcher. So I really had to ask the question of myself, what is it that I really want to understand about our communities? And so that kind of led me on a journey. And I started out by thinking about this phrase. This is from Pat Warden, who says, diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a behavior, but belonging is the emotional outcome that people want in their organization. So we usually talk about DEI, but now we're talking about DEI and B. So this idea of belonging. And I think you'll find as we talk today, this idea of belonging is going to keep coming out. So belonging in a Montessori school is so important. We talk about creating community and making sure that our faculty and staff brings them their authentic selves to the Montessori environment, because the Montessori teacher is that dynamic link between the material and the student. So there's got to be this idea that they belong in our classrooms. So that led me to a question about what is it for students of color? Are we seeing anything different in Montessori schools for students of color? So this was my statement. And you know anything about qualitative research, we always start with a statement of the problem. So for me, the statement was a scant amount of research really is examining this educational experience of students of colors in Montessori school. And this is an important statement because so many students of color are finding their places in our schools, but so many are finding it as a negative experience. And we've talked about this with independent schools, but no one has really looked at Montessori schools specifically. This one statistic here, 40% of African-American students believe that schools treat students differently. This is by Arrington and Stevenson. So I wanted to find out, is that the case still? What's the experience? So I wanted to look at the cultural perceptions of students of color and their families in Montessori schools. So I looked and asked past parents as well as current parents. So here are my two research questions. What's the experience of families of color in Montessori schools? And what can schools do to help support this sense of belonging for their families that they come to their school so they feel like they belong and that more of them come? So mostly I use focus groups, and focus groups are an important aspect of qualitative research because it's an opportunity for small groups to discuss the specific questions or topics around this characteristic of belonging. And there were over 100 hours. So I have to thank many of you, maybe even in the audience, who were allowed me to come into your schools virtually or not to talk to your families about their experience. How did I come up with these families? Well, we did something called snowballing. So one family would tell me about another family and another family would tell me about another family, or a head of school would say, come talk to my parents. And so then we started seeing all of these people wanting to talk about this experience. So that's how we identified our pool of participants. And we wanted to look specifically at individuals who are matriculating in independent Montessori schools. How do we analyze the data? So for qualitative researchers, the way we analyze data is we look at themes. So we get all of this information, reams and reams and reams of data, and the words are the data for us. We transcribe all that information that we're hearing that was recorded, and then we analyze them looking at themes. So we looked at nonverbal cues, we looked at voice tone, we looked at posture, and then we kind of cross-coded. So I did some of my colleagues did some, and then we compared together to see if we were on the same page. And we call that triangulation to make sure that we are being authentic. And so we explored a variety of themes and came up with what we're going to be talking about now. So the first question I asked is, how did you experience race growing up? And the themes that we're going to be exploring, I kind of capitalized using one or two individuals to give us an idea of who they are and how they felt about this. So the quotes we're going to be looking at, this one is from Angela, and Angela is one of our participants. Now, the pictures you see have nothing to do with Angela, and Angela's name is even made up because we want to make sure that their identity is not being disclosed. So for Angela, the theme of this whole section was called "It Still Leaves a Mark." Angela says, I identified as being African-American. I identified also as being Jewish because I also went to Temple, but I definitely identified very early. I knew what I was, no matter how light I was, like I knew what I was. When I was in third grade, my teacher said in front of the entire class that I was an abomination. And Angela is a parent. The teachers always singled me out in a way that they were letting the kids know that I was other. And there were a few different experiences, but that one really sticks in my mind because I remember it like it was yesterday. Wow. So it still leaves a mark. This is Kim under the same kind of idea. I didn't know what else I was. Early on, I remember when we had one of those multicultural days and the teacher is saying, you look like you could be from Kenya, and just sort of like attaching an identity to me. Where my colleagues, my classmates were all saying, you know, I have a parent who's British or Irish, what have you. And so early on, understanding there was something very specific about my identification that I couldn't identify a country of origin. So I think early on, I just kind of understood and embraced being African-American because I didn't know what else I was. Wynette, this is real. It's an experience that my husband had as a college student. It's just an experience that he had that first opened my eyes to this, that this is serious stuff that, you know, people talk about, that African Americans talk about. This is real. So he was simply returning to his dorm after a day of being out in classes or whatever. And, you know, he walks into his dorm and a white girl walks in ahead of him. He walks in and, you know, he's going to his mailbox, checking his mail. And all of a sudden there's like a whole bunch of police. The woman who had walked in ahead of him didn't think he belonged. And so she called the police on him, even though he belonged in that dorm. This is Trey. It took a lot. I was born in Ghana, came to the States briefly and returned to Ghana. Was in England for a while because of visa trouble. And then we ended up in upstate New York, central New York. Our family was the only Black American family in the village, and it took a lot. I remember telling my mother that I felt like I was an alien like that. I didn't have a lot in common with any of my peers, really. We didn't listen to the same music. We didn't appreciate the same things. So it took a lot. And pretty much all growing up, we were the only Black family. This is Jessie. Okay, so anyway, I was saying that I was in first grade, Asheboro, North Carolina. And the way that the school was set up, if the city actually was like this, and by city, I mean Dry County town where I grew up, wow. It was self-segregated by race socially. And so you could see it everywhere in the town, but definitely at school. And I remember we had broke for recess and the kids separated, and it was, all the Black girls were playing together and all the white girls were playing together. And I didn't know where to go. I couldn't, nobody had told me what I was, anything except Indian. And I didn't know where to go. And I actually was friends with this girl, Faye, who was Black. And I started walking towards her and I seemed confused. And they said, Jessie, are you Black? Are you white? I didn't know the answer to that question. Amy, tell them who you are. It was probably the second month in primary for my son. I was there at the school and the teacher kept calling my son the name of the other Chinese boy in the class 2 or 3 times. And the first time I was like, I'm just gonna let it go. But then I had him say something. I didn't say it. I was like, Yin, tell him who you are. I wanted him to know that being called whoever's name of all my life, even though no, that's not you, is not right. But I told him because I was like, that teacher should know you can't be calling every Asian boy you see, whatever made you decide to choose this, right? And so, yeah, maybe that was my baggage, but I wanted him to educate that teacher. And I don't want to be the one who's saying, I want him to know that it's coming from Yin. I want to stop here for a moment and stop my share and drop in the chat. What do you think? Was there a theme that you saw throughout these? And I could have gone on and on and on for just about everyone that I interviewed. Was there a theme that you saw that you're seeing with these families of color, these parents? Go ahead, Kathleen, you just speak it out or drop it in the chat. If you can unmute.
Just ostracization, unacceptance, in some cases, unacceptable, that's not even the right word. Horrible things were being said about the children. Horrible.
Absolutely.
Horrible, horrible, horrible.
So thank you. Other things people are saying, they didn't know where they belonged, marginalization, feeling othered, stuck with these individuals, and it felt confusing and hurtful, othering, marginalization, confusion, and identity. So I think the thing that's important for us to realize is that these are the parents who are coming to our schools. So their experience what do you think their experience is? What are they bringing with them when they come to our schools? Drop it in the chat or please feel free to raise your virtual hand or just unmute yourself.
All of that. They're bringing all of that.
So there's a beautiful book by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot that you might have read earlier that's called Conversations. And she talks about the fact that parents are bringing the baggage of trauma. That's exactly it. Fear and hope and trauma. They're bringing a level of baggage with them that we need to be aware of. Absolutely. And they're bringing their own stories. So the reality is that when they come to you, they're feeling defensive already because their experience has been such a negative one. And parent after parent, family after family, every single family that I interviewed, and remember, I have over 100 hours of focus groups. And of those focus groups, we typically have about 10. So the representation is large. Even those individuals, those families who say, well, I didn't have any racialized incidents. But as other people started talking, they realized, actually I did. And some of them have buried them very deeply, but they are still bringing them to your school. So what are the implications, do you think, for us as administrators, if they're bringing that baggage? Yeah, please, Jim.
Well, we're already at a disadvantage. We're working uphill to begin with. I might be the most neutral and available administrator of any school at any time, but that doesn't, in that moment, you're up against it because they are coming with baggage that luggage with preconceptions. And so our task becomes all the more sensitive, all the more significant in terms of meeting that challenge of being sensitive to what they are saying and what they're not saying.
Absolutely. I love this not feeling of belonging, trauma, seeing if the environment has changed. I love that, seeing if the environment has changed, because you're coming with baggage. And then all of a sudden you say, but I'm going to pay money, find this incredible organization that I know is going to love my child, but I'm seeing the exact same thing. So your radar is already up, right?
Yeah.
And then you're seeing a perpetuation of what you saw, because I loved Amy's thought that the teacher keeps calling my child someone else's name, or doesn't even take the time to realize that I'm not from Kenya, those kinds of things. Have to overcome and ensure we are creating a safe environment where everyone belongs. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Let's go a little bit farther. So let's talk about some students who come from our schools and what they think. Here's a student experience of Andrew. And I could have had hundreds of these. It's a big weight. Actually, it's very interesting because while I was there talking about his school, I didn't think very much about it. But I think I wasn't aware of it. But school was laden with a kind of cynicism. And I had to play a role of helping to educate my classmates that would say something stupid about race. And I guess I was almost like a bridge between, and that was a big weight to carry. I didn't realize it at the time, but now that I'm out of that environment, I really felt like there was a certain way I needed to speak to them that wouldn't put them over the edge and decide they weren't going to listen to me. I'm just realizing that it was a big weight. So, I'm sorry, I'm kind of navigating my screen today and it's just not working the way I wanted to. Okay, we talked about what you noticed. I could go on and on, but there were 3 themes that I found when we looked through the reams of data, myself and my colleagues, that families of color are looking for a sense of psychological safety, not just physical safety for themselves and their students, but psychological safety, as we talked about, and you said so eloquently in your in the chat and spoke about, that they're already coming with trauma and they want to protect their children from that trauma. The other theme that was really much a part of all of this was seek first to understand. That we have as a tendency as Montessorians, as an educators in general, that we believe we already know the answer, as opposed to finding out where the family is coming from, what their experience is like, and how we can support them in our environment. And if our environment has to change, we do such a beautiful job in creating an environment for our students, that we change the environment for the children that walk in through our doors, and that we make sure that we're knowing them as individuals. Are we knowing their families as well? And so many times we hear that we want, excuse me, that as educators, we need to do our own homework and become educated about this. So not just assume that everyone walking in the door is going to be the exact same individual or have an upbringing like our own. So let's explore these. This sense of psychological safety, just keeping yourself safe. This is what Tori said. But in terms of just keeping yourself safe, we did have those discussions. Like, if you're driving and you get stopped by a cop, this is what you do. If you're in a store, don't be like picking stuff up and walking around, just stuff to keep yourself safe, and those kinds of discussions. I told them, because you're the Black boy, you might get targeted, or people are going to look to you first if there's an issue. I want to stop this share for a minute. As I continue to do this work, one of the things that I'm asking schools to look at is who is getting referred in your classrooms. Typically we have, at Montessori schools in general, unless they're public, typically have a smaller percentage of students of color. So who is being disciplined the most? Take note of that. Try to do some statistics on that. Because what we're finding more and more often is that it's the black boy of color, or the black boy or the child of color who's male, who is not normalizing the way we typically would say, the normalization, that his way of functioning in the environment might be different. I had a wonderful Montessori administrator say to me, Val, I'm beginning to question whether normalization looks the same for everyone? Is it all the same? Do all children normalize in the same way? I see people shaking their heads, no. But are we requesting them to do that? Is the teacher in the classroom saying that unless everyone is sitting at my circle doing it this way for this long period of time, otherwise that's a child who's had some trouble? So thinking about that and asking that question and doing the research to figure that out is going to be important. Let me go back. And please feel free to drop in the chat if you have any thoughts about this as we go along. So looking at the sense of psychological safety, here's Wynette and Angela, who you met before. The idea of raising Black boys in the US totally freaks me out, like completely. I know that they will have a very different experience to what, I have 3 older brothers, what my brothers had in Trinidad as favor with my husband and had growing up. I need a place for them that is racially safe. Angela, but I didn't want her to be in an environment where she had to feel like she was other. I wanted her to be in an environment where she felt like she could be herself, 100% herself in every way possible, and that she can develop into the person that she's meant to be without having fear of showing who she is to anyone. The experiences that I had made me want to give Montessori to my child. Isn't it interesting that for Angela and for Wynette, they chose our schools specifically because they believe that they're going to be a psychological safety net for their child, that they won't feel othered, that they will be in a place where they will be racially safe. And is our school the school where we don't even talk about race? That it's a topic that doesn't come up because we believe that all lives matter, or that if we talk about it because children are racially blind, that will be okay. How does that look? Interesting. We get the contact information, of course. Sorry, I just saw that come up. Okay, next. So here it kind of goes into this providing safe spaces to talk about race. One of the things that our culture as Americans has done is it causes us to be afraid to talk about race for fear of being called racist. But in reality, talking about race makes us, especially for our students, makes it possible for them to be comfortable with their own race and recognize that there is nothing forbidden about it, that in fact, it's something to be celebrated. And here's a quote. Sometimes I feel as if I don't have a voice at the school. I realize that in Montessori, we're supposed to observe and not be an impact on the classroom, but I don't know if there's a place for me to talk about the things we've talked about today, talking about race. I feel like we need that space, that it's okay to talk about race and its impact. So the next area is this idea of a sense of belonging. I want him to feel like he belongs. Remember, we had these 3 buckets that the themes came into. So Trey says, I don't know what he'll be like growing up, My experience is not his. It will be his, and it'll be different than mine. And I desperately want him to feel like he belongs, for him to see himself and have a strong identity. That's what I hope the school can support. And let me stop right here to talk a little bit, I'll stop my share for a minute, and talk about what that means when she's saying a strong identity. When we talk about identity, how many of you thought, and you just say this in your mind, you don't have to show me, think about strong racial identity when you think about identity? How many of you see that as important? Think of it into your mind. Oh, I see some people raising their hands. Great. Because many times we think about, do they have a strong sense of self? Do they feel like they are being challenged within the classroom? Do they have freedom within the classroom? All the things that Dr. Montessori talked about. But one of the things we know, especially for children of color in the United States, that having a strong racial identity is part and parcel to them feeling like they belong. The research is replete with this, that there are pieces of, especially students of color, that if we don't acknowledge that, and they don't see the windows and mirrors within the classroom, that it will impede their opportunity to feel like they're part of the class and then succeed. So many times the challenge we have maybe with behavior or things like that might be a symptom of them not seeing themselves in the classroom, or them not feeling their whole selves, and therefore they act out because they don't understand why they're feeling this disjointed way. Something to consider. And please, I'm one of those who, if you want to chat, jump in there and drop me a chat or raise your virtual hand or unmute yourself, please feel free to do that. Those who know me well know that I have no problem with that. Right, Ellie? All right, go into the next one. When we talked about seeking first to understand, this is, I think, an extremely important one. So many of if we have students of color who are coming from other neighborhoods or other areas, travel a long way. So this parent was having this statement. She said, so what I talk to them, teachers, a lot about is, you know, when you see a boy of color in the morning and he's slumped in his chair, your automatic is, oh, he don't want to work hard or whatever the case. And I said, he's been on the bus since 6, you know? So give him a minute, ask him, are you tired? So here's this idea that making assumptions, knowing the child, understanding the family, the situation, what's going on and when they come to school. And so your expectation is, and we do this really well in Montessori generally, is that maybe it takes him a little bit longer or her a little bit longer to get into the work because they're exhausted, or maybe they've had a difficult night for whatever reason. This is a school that goes to high school. And so the mom says, so I had to hand out the pins for National Merit Scholars for those seniors, right? No boys of color. Because when I first got there and I volunteered at the Blank Festival, you show up and they all have their aprons on. These are the moms, have their aprons on, and they're all talking and you're standing over here and they're telling you to sell the gummies, right? So that really annoyed me because maybe it took me back. And her idea was that, yes, she's been invited to be part of this parent festival that's going on, but not engaged. So the parents who are the white parents are talking over here. She says, you sell, but nobody's bringing her in. Are we making sure that for our families, especially families of color who are minorities in our organization, are we making sure that they feel like they're being included? Are we making effort to go out and bring them in so they're not just selling the gummies on the side and everybody else is talking to each other? So in this seek to first to understand, this theme came out, do your homework. My husband is African-American, and the struggle that I have, and this is just great that we're having this conversation because I've been really stewing about this a lot. A lot of what I guess is the dominant narrative that's told about African-Americans tends to be very oppression-based or oppression adjacent. I did my research, reached out to all my publisher friends, and I said, listen, I need a list of books where the protagonist in it is a Black person. Nobody is being murdered or no one's being oppressed in shackles. Like, I just need a good storyline about Black people. I don't care if it's sci-fi, I need it. And I was able to come up with 20 titles. I want my school to understand that the narrative needs to be balanced. I want them to do their homework too. So looking at our collection of books and literature that we have in our library, do we have a plethora of stories? Are we looking at our community and making sure that we have windows and mirrors within our library, or the stories or the movies that we show or whatever that we're doing, the field trips that we go on, that we're making sure that we're thinking about it with an equity lens, that everyone is being represented in some way during our field trips or during the books that we read, and not just in a negative light. Okay, so with all of this, one of the things we did was we developed, I'm sorry, I have a chat here. I found it difficult when the child is hesitant to even delve into their identity and art explorations. Oh, I'd love to talk with you about that, Ramin. Thank you so much for pulling that out, because that says a lot, doesn't it? And let me just go through this piece and then let's go back to that, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's the creation of safe space, and I'm not sure I have all the tools.
Yes, I love that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm an art teacher in a Montessori school, so I try and create projects where students are delving into their family origins, identity, whatever it can be. And I found sometimes that some of the students that are from minority races, that there's a hesitancy to explore and it's a vulnerable thing to do for anybody. And so, and especially when there are a few in class that are, different from others, there's a hesitancy to stick out. And so they'll just shut down and just give me something that is not very deep. And I understand it. I just don't know how to help it sometimes. Sometimes I'm able to, because I am also from a different culture. So I try and bring that into the project. But sometimes it's very deep and heavy, and I sometimes I'm not successful.
Yep. Can you tell me about the age groups that you work with?
This usually happens more in middle school.
school,
I
yeah.
teach from 4th to 8th. In upper L, 4th to 6th, there seems to be more, not so much, focus on the self and being, kind of that societal worriness. But as they get older into the middle school, that's when it just starts. All the societal pressures, I think, come to be, and things start to shut down. And
Absolutely.
it's very tragic, and I try and help, and I need more tools.
And I would argue that actually we're starting to build that foundation when they're 3 to 6 months old. Believe it or not, there's a ton of research that's demonstrating that this idea of racialized identity begins very, very early. And the idea of what's good and bad begins early. And then it's kind of almost cemented by the time that they're 9 or 10. And then as they begin to explore their own identity, it becomes what you're seeing, Ramin, in the middle school years. And I'd love to talk about, unfortunately, the time, I was looking at my time and I was like, oh my God, the time doesn't allow us to do it today. But let me go back. That was a great discussion. Thank you. So my colleagues and I developed a model of how to think about our work with our students in our schools. And there's a couple of models we'll be discussing today that we're going to go through rather quickly, and I apologize for that, but I think it's important to at least talk about it. So we took the model from counseling and applied that to this idea of looking at bias as well as race, ethnicity, and culture within our schools. So there are awareness competencies, knowledge competencies, skills competencies, and actions competencies. And we were just talking earlier about the skills competencies, making sure that we can actually do the things we need to do to help students feel comfortable in our classrooms. But starting with the awareness competencies, we have to start from ourselves. And you've heard this a million times, but it bears repeating because I have to do it as well because I have my own implicit biases that I have to work on every day. But awareness of our own attitudes about race, about culture, how comfortable we are talking about it, understanding our own biases and assumptions, and making sure that we acknowledge the fact that we all have them. Then the knowledge competencies, making sure that we have factual information about the students that are in our classrooms. So I use African-American students, but we could say that about LGBTQ+, about Asian students. There are so many. If we have a community that's diverse, we need to know about that diverse community and be very specific about the knowledge and ask and make sure that we have understanding. Skills competencies is having a toolbox with us that helps us to know the kinds of questions we can ask, how to have conversations that are supportive of our families, especially in conferences with families of color or for minoritized families. Action competencies, then implementing steps to achieve this competence. So it is not just enough to know and then have the skills if we're not doing anything about it, because we know that it's going to support our students, having them and their families feel satisfaction and success within our schools. So let's talk about each one of these rather quickly. So in terms of awareness, examine your attitudes, recognize that right now, especially, the socio-political realities are so huge for students of color and their families. And then think about the soft bigotry of low expectations that happens many times, especially in schools where we may have a segment of the population that is coming from low SES. And do we have a soft bigotry toward that? Maybe saying, well, it's so hard for them, I'm not going to have the same expectations as we have for other students, those kinds of things. Knowledge, recognize that families come with already trauma, with all kinds of racialized trauma, and that we have to make sure that we're continuously having professional development. Many times schools will come to me and say, Val, I would like to have professional development on bias. And then that's the only professional development they're going to have for the entire year. And what we know from the research, it says that professional development like that does not work, that it has to be ongoing, it has to be deep, and it has to be frequent, because we will fall back into our own, our comfort space where we were without even understanding or recognizing it. And that the other part of this knowledge is remembering that students from minoritized cultures, from underrepresented cultures, those students are aware of injustice more than students from the majority culture, much more. And there's tons of research to support that as well. Develop some skills. One of the skills we'll be talking about in the next half an hour or so is the skill of broaching and being able to discuss racial ethnic concerns with our students. And let's talk about that now. Dr. Devine and I created what's called the continuum of broaching behavior. And what it does is it helps us understand where our school lies in its ability to talk about the kinds of topics we were just discussing today. And if you look at this continuum, it goes from the lowest level to the highest level. So our lowest level is avoiding broaching or talking about it at all. And we're going to talk about what that specifically looks like in a moment. Then the next level is continuing incongruent, integrated congruent broaching behavior, and then finally infused. And that's the highest form when we talk about this continuum of broaching behavior. So let's look at the broaching continuum. For an avoidance school, if they're avoidant, the stance is going to be that they will reprimand quietly if something happens within their school. They won't address it. There's no school-wide communication when something happens, and it's not considered a teachable moment. I will give you an example. There was a school I was working with where a middle school student used the N-word in class out loud to a lot of other students. And when confronted by the other students, she said, well, they use it in rap. This is a white student who said it. They use it in rap and it's a free country. I should be able to use it. Administration panicked, locked it down, took the student away, reprimanded her quietly. Eventually, because of all of this, the student left the school, but it was never addressed to the other students. Eventually, it became a huge deal because it was not considered a teachable moment. And it was hidden from parents. And it became this kind of consternation of churning that happened within the school. A school school stance that's continuing and incongruent, they recognize that they're supposed to say something, but they don't have the tools to address issues that come up about race or ethnicity. And so they're awkward, it's superficial, it's inappropriate. An integrated school, they understand that you're supposed to address controversial issues and they're thoughtful and well-intentioned, but it's only individual students, individual teachers within the school who do it. So a couple of classrooms, administrators haven't really mastered the art and science of this idea of how you address controversial topics when you talk about race. So there are pockets within the organization, but it's not the entire organization. So of course, an infused school, social justice is part of the fabric of the school. There's school-wide professional development. Everyone, including parents, can talk openly and honestly about race. And when things happen, they know how to address it. So what's said and what's done? In an avoidance school, nothing's done when racialized topics happen. In fact, it's considered under the radar. We don't talk about it. If we don't talk about it, then we can't be considered racist or we won't have something flare up. A continuing incongruent school might say something like all lives matter. When they discuss race, ethnicity, and culture, the administration may say to them, well, just do it, but there are no tools to accompany that. In an integrated school, there's thoughtful reflection. People talk about it and think about it, and they're listening and thinking and training on it, but it may not be throughout the school. And of course, an infused school, they engage in racial issues, they talk about it, and it's effective, and they have professional development that's constant and school-wide. So what's the rationale behind schools that are avoidant? Typically, it's fear of becoming be called racist. They're also afraid that there are parents within the community that might look askance if they make a stand. So it's much easier for them to kind of go with the path of least resistance and not say anything. Their fear of losing funders who believe that this whole equity thing is too much emphasis on it and it's not helpful, that it actually causes divisions, therefore the school doesn't want to talk about it. They may want the problem to disappear, or they just lack the skill set. Or within the organization itself, there's no consensus. I was working with a school recently where literally the whole community is diametrically opposed. There's a whole group that believes that, that you must embrace this completely and social justice should be their bent. And there's another whole section of the school that's almost split in half that says, we've already done too much, that is alienating people, and my child is only thinking about race. So finding that consensus is going to be important for a school that's avoidant. Then the continuing incongruent, they lack the tools to manage these issues of race, but they know that they're supposed to. And then in integrated congruent, individual teachers have this lived experience. So maybe individual teachers go to conferences and individual teachers have book groups, but it's not the entire community. And infused, the entire school has this lived experience. With avoidant individual teachers, the teachers themselves believe that students are colorblind. So there's no need to really talk about race, because if you do, it makes them color sensitive, and instead of embracing it. In continuing incongruent, they recognize that the issues warrant discussion, but because they don't have the tools, they don't talk about it. They're not able to facilitate a dialogue that's really helpful and successful. Integrated congruent, again, it's this heightened sense that there are efforts that are happening and people are doing things, but it's individual effort. And infused, it's a whole school effort. In terms of administrative response, in an avoidance school, the administrative response is typically top down. And the top down is to ignore the issue. Like the school I talked about earlier, the administrator told the faculty that we've solved it and we're not going to talk about it anymore. It is done. Told the middle school students we're not talking about it anymore. Not recognizing that the middle school students were talking to each other about it and parents were talking about it. So it really hadn't been handled. Discipline is handled quietly and there's no training on handling issues. Continuing incongruent, there's a mandate to talk about it, but there are no tools. Integrated congruent, training occurs, but it's not infused. And then finally, infused, there's an equity audit where people know exactly where the school is going, what is the measurable goals the school has toward this idea of equity, and making sure that everyone feels a sense of belonging, and that faculty and students are all social justice minded. So we also want to look at these things systemically. And for avoidance schools, when you look at the systems in place, typically there's little collection of data. They don't have any idea of how many students leave the school, how many students of color or from minoritized groups, maybe they're LGBTQ plus community, leave the school. So they have no idea. They have a sense, but no idea, because they're not collecting the data. They're not disaggregating the data. And honestly, diversity is data driven in many times. That's at least the beginning of it. In an avoidance school, race and equity is reflected in hiring, onboarding, and evaluation process. It's just not there. And there's no commitment to diversity in hiring. With continuing incongruent, the data is collected, but nobody does anything with it. It's disaggregated, but no one does much with it. And once you have that information, there's no way to disseminate it to others or make any real promising moves toward supporting the rest of the community, because you don't know what to do with the data. Integrated congruent, there's collection and disaggregation. Some parts of the school are using it really well. Maybe admissions is doing a really great job, but in the classroom, maybe there's not so much. And it's aspirational as opposed to being practical. In infused schools, they're collecting data and analyzing it. They're disaggregating it with an eye towards race equity, and it's reflected in every aspect of the organization, in hiring, onboarding, evaluation, and process. Let me stop for a second because I see a chat. What types of data should a school collect and how? Great question. And there's that could be a whole hour on what that looks like and how do you collect it. So thank you for asking that. But some things are retention, attrition, who's on financial aid, who's referred to the office in a classroom, how many times, those kinds of information. But we can talk a lot about that later on. What are the consequences for the avoidance school? The potential is for anger and disengagement, for withdrawals. You wonder, why can't I keep families of color? And the family of color will say something like, oh, you know, we needed to go because this other school is cheaper, or it's closer, or Montessori isn't really for me. When actually, if you dug deeper, you would find out that they didn't feel supported within the organization. So it's kind of this catch-22. You don't keep families of color, so you can't get families of color. You don't keep teachers of color, so you can't get teachers of color. Political flashpoints, I've seen schools where parents rally and then whole segments of the population leave because the school is racially illiterate. And continuing incongruent, what are the consequences? Gaffes, letters that might not, that have that fall on deaf ears because the tone is not set so that it feels inclusive. When the discussion happens that's racialized, it's handled so poorly that people get angry and upset or feel disenfranchised. In an integrated congruent school, while there's racial literacy, it may be inconsistent. So there's some teachers who handle it exceptionally well, or some administrators who handle it well, but the one or two who don't kind of color the rest of the organization. But in a infused school, everyone feels that they are competent. They can broach, they're not afraid to talk about race. There's a framework that the school has accepted to address issues, and people know what happens if a racialized issue occurs. And so they're not derailed because things are going to happen. But because they have something in place and they're literate, it works. So the themes are just silence is for avoidant, limited engagement is continuing, integrated is some of us, and infusing is all of us. Let me stop here for a second so I just let you digest it, because then we'll kind of pivot a little bit and talk about conversations that happen in class. Do you have recommendations for recruiting staff members of color? Absolutely, absolutely. And it is a challenge in Montessori. And in fact, let's take a second to talk about, why do you think I would say it's a challenge in Montessori? What about a Montessori training that you think might make it challenging to recruit teachers of color? You can drop it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself.
For one, they can't afford it.
They can't afford it. Great.
It's
Money.
the most expensive one.
Yep, time involved.
Or they can't reach it because it's not within their locality.
Mhm.
And it's not within their radar. So there's no opening for that in their radar. So only if they worked with you and then you send them for training, then you have it. That's the major part of it.
Mhm. And think about it, if you're in AMI school, typically you have to stop your life and not work while you're training.
And they can't do
Who can do that? You know, that is the information I'm sharing, published or printed anywhere. It is, but not in Montessori journals right now. There's one article that I wrote that is in the International Montessori Council has it. We're working on a book right now though. So you're like on the cusp of all the stuff I'm doing. Oh, so many of our teachers are former parents. So the prior diversity of the school matters. Ooh, that's a great statement. And actually, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is so very true. That is so very true. That's so very true. I know the reason that I became a Montessori teacher, my own history, and this is back in the 90s, is because I wanted Montessori for my son. I put him in the school, and the head of school came to me and said, you need to get trained. And so she paid for my training. Otherwise, I would never be here. And because of that, I became a Montessori head of school, and this is where I am. And I have to attribute that to that first head of school who kind of plucked me out of the wood and said, I'm anointing you, you need to go get training. And taking out a year of your life to do this is onerous. And so, yes, it is kind of from a privileged perspective that we do that. So good point.
I can add two more to that.
Okay.
One is the training is built in such a way, at least for what my experience was, that I couldn't send a teacher who had a young child. Okay, so it cut her off because the hours and the time that she needed to spend there was not, she couldn't do the babysitting. She couldn't manage the life. And usually people of color do come with children. Most of the time they are single, handling the situation. At least the people of color a parent of people of color that I had in my school that I was looking to train. So it's their whole life situation is very, very different. They're not free to make the choices like someone else in their position.
So our training, would it be fair to say that our training comes from a place of privilege? It started with basically women who had someone else at home who could do their income for them. That's why we paid them so little, You know, it wasn't their main salary. And so we still have the vestiges of that unfairness. I got to move on, you guys. I'm sorry, because it's 10 minutes and I've got like a half an hour, 45 minutes worth of stuff, but okay. Thank you for that. So let's go to the implications for practice. From the research that I just talked about, help students connect to the school community so that they can feel safe. Develop a strategic plan for fostering this sense of belonging. Events, mentoring, dialogue about experiences, make sure that that's included. And consider providing a place for students to come home psychologically. I've just finished some focus groups with some parents from Montessori schools just the other day, because I continue to do this research. I haven't stopped. And to a student, these were students this time, they kept saying that there was one teacher within the school that they could go to, or that they felt like they could go to, and I called it coming home. And it was typically the assistant of color or the one teacher of color that they could go talk to. So who is that space within your community where they can come home psychologically? Minoritized families typically feel that they're not as connected. So reach out to them regularly before trouble. Be proactive in your discussions of race, ethnicity, and culture. And then consider an equity audit so that you can understand your school's position. It's like, you know, there's these great commercials that talk about your home and that you don't know the smells until somebody else comes in and tells you about it. It's the same with our schools. We don't typically, because we have a blind spot for our schools, we typically don't know where our Achilles heel is. So having someone else come in and to do that for you is really helpful. All right, so let me see if there, oops, sorry. I think I saw some in the chat come up. Okay, so Montessori Institute of Dallas, AMI Training Center seeks out public districts, gives scholarships, and looks for diversity. Excellent. You have to come back, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about having conversations about race, and it's just some ideas to think about. I don't have enough time to actually give you the tools, but I want you to think about some of these things. The problem of American race relations is not simply rooted in a failure as a society to have an in-depth, meaningful conversation about race. The problem rests in our denial and refusal to admit to our fears of what such a conversation will ignite. And the reality is these are tough conversations to have, and we have to be so comfortable with ourselves and vulnerable to be able to have these kinds of conversations. So I want to first define, what is race talk exactly? What do we mean when we say that? These are conversations where we or the other person feels threatened in terms of different racial or ethnic groups, that we are talking specifically about race, because in the United States, that's not something we talk about with easily. It also has an opportunity to talk about our different worldviews when worldviews are challenged publicly. That one of us or both of us finds the conversation might be offensive, and that because it's the deep culture that we're talking about, our innermost fears, it can arouse really intense emotions. And remember, we talked earlier about the fact that many of our families of color are already coming with the baggage of racialized trauma. So that's important for us to know. So there's anger and frustration there that they may not even be able to navigate for themselves. And that could disrupt the communication that we're having. They're often instigated by microaggressions. And there's always this relationship of power that's unequal, the power imbalance. And again, if you haven't read Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work about conversations, it's a really great one to read, because she speaks eloquently about this power dynamic that happens, racialized or not, between teachers and parents. Let me just check this one. Oops. Okay. So going on to this idea of context. Context, context, context. Context is probably one of the most important words. If you don't take anything away today, this is important. One of the reasons that educators avoid, as Montessorians even, that we avoid these discussions, because we're afraid that if the discussion happens, especially in middle school, if we start talking about race, that it might antagonize a discussion and things will go out of control, and we'll lose control of either the conference, that we're having with the parent, or we'll lose control within the classroom. And then we feel helpless, and the ability to come back from something that might be so damaging and hurt feelings that we just don't know what to say. So how do we set the stage for these difficult dialogues? And I'll just go through this rather quickly because I know we're coming up on it and I'm sorry. Your role as an educator is to stimulate thinking. So your role within your classroom is to stimulate thinking with your parents, with each other, to enhance student participation so that they're thinking, even our youngest ones can think about this, to facilitate trust. And then here's probably the most important part that I think we all need training in, that some of us say that we do this really well, but to reframe comments by capturing the essence of what is said. So using that is a real tool, because many times we'll say, well, I understand what that person was saying. You might not. So reframing it really helps us to do that. Identify the interests of the other person and be sensitive to all the lenses that they're bringing to us. This is one of my favorite quotes about listening. When I listen with the heart, I stop playing the game of non-listening. In other words, I step inside the other's skin. I walk in her shoes. I attempt to see things from her point of view. I establish eye contact. I give her conscious attention. I reflect my understanding of her words. I question. I attempt to clarify. I grant her worth. So I'm going to stop. Let me just one more. So paraphrasing is important for not only us, but we do that too. If you have a piece table in your classroom, I'm sure many times that you help students to paraphrase, but sometimes we forget to do that ourselves. So you identify the main point of whoever's talking, the feeling associated with that statement, label what's going on, put your concern into words, and then check for understanding. Those are the important parts of that. So I'm going to stop here because I know that I want you to be able to ask any questions, and we've like 2 minutes. I do apologize, but please ask any questions. Should we strive to have our school reflect the racial and ethnic makeup of the larger community in which we live? You know what, I'd like to challenge you on that. And I think that's a lovely start, but wouldn't it be lovely if we said that we want to be better than the community around us? Because I did a presentation for MPPI, which is the Montessori Public Policy Initiative. And if we notice that we live in racialized, segregated areas, and that's from the 1930s until now, that has been because of redlining and a variety of things. So if you seek to reflect your community, you might not get very far depending on where you live. So I would encourage you and push you to kind of push a little bit harder and faster to make a community that is, where race, ethnicity, and culture has no bearing, that it doesn't matter because you are being inclusive of everyone and they want to come to you because of that inclusivity. Because I guarantee you that if you are able to unlock that, the gifts that's going to bring to your community are like no other. I hope that answered it. It's okay if we can go over a few minutes. Oh, okay. Well, she said I can go over a few minutes. And I think I can't go over a few minutes. I think I'm the one who has something to do. Wait a minute. Let me just check really quickly. I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second. Yes, because I have something in a few minutes. So that's why I can't go over very far. But at any rate, any questions about what I had? Thank you for that statement. Please feel free to either drop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand or just shout out if you have a question or a statement or comment.
Is it okay if I share your email in the chat?
Yep. And also I have a website that I'm happy to share with you as well. Okay. I like my name, so you hear it a lot. Oh, please, Johnny, it's a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Feel free to drop me a line if you have questions or thoughts, or if you think to yourself, Val, you didn't ask this particular question, you should be researching that. I'm always looking for ideas like that. This is a passion of mine, and I feel like an opportunity to give back to the community that I love.
Thank you so much, Val. I don't want to keep you over if you have another meeting to attend. But for those of you who want to stay on, I have a parenting education event that I'm going to briefly talk about. So if you have time to stay on for that, But thank you so much, Val. Maybe we'll have you back sometime in the future. That would be amazing.
Love it. Love you guys. And thank you so much for doing the work that you do in unprecedented times. I think yesterday showed us that Montessori work is not finished, that we have to work harder and faster. So thank you so much. Take good care. Masalama.
Thank you, Val.
Assalamu.
And for everyone else who's still on the call, I'm going to talk about a Montessori Thrive parenting education event. So you may have gotten an email about this already, but starting next Wednesday, we're doing these kind of Zoom calls, but for your parent community, because we had one of our members talk about how administrators really feel the pressures of, having to educate their parents on Montessori philosophies and parenting at home. So we have a 6-week series. It's going to start next Wednesday. There'll be hour-long sessions just like this. They'll be towards the evening. It was a bit difficult to accommodate for the times, as we have many different time zones in the US, but the recordings will be available for you to download on Thrive and to pass out to any parents who can't attend the live meetings. But we have some amazing speakers that will be joining us to talk about all sorts of subjects, and we have a variety of age ranges as well. So we have someone coming to talk about neonatal, infant, toddler, primary, elementary school, and adolescent as well. If you don't have the registration information, it's on Thrive, and I'm going to go ahead and drop the now this is the parenting series. Sorry, I'm looking for the link. This is a link that does not have the registration links, but the ones that do are on Thrive. So you should have gotten it in an email, and feel free to drop a comment if you haven't received it. But we're looking forward to seeing your parents there, and hopefully they learn and take from the event. And we're hoping that it can be an ongoing event. So maybe we'll pick it up again sometime after the 6 weeks are up. But yeah, we'd love to see your parent community and be able to help them. You already do so much for them already. So if anyone has any questions about our parenting education event, feel free to ask or to email me, and I'll go ahead and drop my email in the chat as well. But yeah, and then next week, we won't be having a town hall meeting with a speaker, but we will have open office hours. So if you have any questions or just want to talk to one of us at Needle Marketing, we'll still be here. We just won't have a speaker on. Any questions?
Did I hear you say earlier that you were going to put Dr. Wise's email address in the chat?
Yes, it's up here. I put it just earlier. I did put it somewhere. I put that on the website. Let me just put it in one more time, just in case. This is her email address. And yeah, feel free to email her with any further questions. Is it working?
Didn't go in.
Oh, it did not show up. Oh, I see why. There we go.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
If there's no further questions, feel free to email me. Let me drop in my email. And I will see you guys next week if you guys come for the open hours.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Thank you for joining.
Bye-bye.